Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a soldier or a spy. I'm just a systems analyst from Leicester with a hobby for fringe science and too much time on my hands since the divorce. My name is Alan Graves, 38 years old, and I work for a small cybersecurity firm called Grey Solutions, mostly designing intrusion detection protocols for mid-sized logistics companies. The kind of job where nobody really asks what you're doing as long as the invoices keep getting paid. But this story doesn't start with my work. It starts in my garage, more specifically in my side project, an experiment I had been playing with ever since stumbling across a declassified document dump from CERN back in 2023. Most of it was routine technical babble, safety procedures, magnet realignments, nothing special. But tucked into the logs was a single phrase that stood out to me. Microscopic quantum lattice decay, signature diverged by 13% from baseline readings, likely instrumentation error. It was the phrase, likely instrumentation error, that piqued my curiosity. The deeper I looked, the more it seemed like certain fringe elements at CERN believed they had seen something. Not large, not world-shattering, but anomalous. Something they didn't want to admit publicly for fear of ridicule or backlash. And that's where my obsession began. Using some very creative interpretation of freely available blueprints from various academic research papers and scrounging spare parts off eBay and university surplus auctions, I built what I called the LFE, Localized Frequency Entangler. It's a glorified vacuum chamber with modified RF emitters, precision gyroscopes, and an overclocked Raspberry Pi 5 acting as its brain. Don't get me wrong, this wasn't a portal gun. I didn't expect to see anything. I just wanted to confirm the anomaly, maybe publish a paper, maybe present at a weird science expo in Brighton. That was it. But then it happened. It was 2:17 AM on May 4th. I remember the exact time because the stopwatch was still running when I came back. I'd been tuning the RF emitters and had just uploaded a new frequency oscillation pattern when the chamber, normally humming with soft white light, flashed blue. Not just blue, a radiant deep cobalt that shimmered like liquid. There was a loud pop, the kind you hear when you're too close to a subwoofer, and then silence. Except I wasn't in my garage anymore. I blinked, expecting to see the walls of concrete and pegboards of old tools, but instead I was standing on a street, an empty street, London. More specifically, Tottenham Court Road, near Goodge Street Station. But it wasn't the London I knew. For one, it was completely silent, the usual hum of traffic, the clatter of buses and taxis, the chatter of crowds, all gone. The city looked abandoned. A thin layer of dust coated the pavement. Trash lay untouched in corners. A black cab sat skewed on the sidewalk with its door wide open. I stood there frozen, feeling a light breeze brush against my skin. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It felt off. I turned slowly, scanning for any signs of life. Streetlights still worked. I could hear a faint mechanical buzz from a nearby electrical junction box. But there were no people, no movement. Then I saw the posters, old, sun-bleached and peeling, but unmistakable. State of Emergency Infectious Aggression Virus in big red letters across the NHS logo, and below that, the Royal Coat of Arms and something in thick stencil, Evacuate Greater London immediately. My stomach dropped. The design was nearly identical to the fictional ones in 28 Days Later, a movie I'd seen at least 10 times. But this wasn't a film set. This was real. The smell of mildew and old rubber filled the air. A light drizzle began to fall, barely noticeable, but enough to coat the dust with a thin smear of grime. I backed into the nearest building, an electronics shop called Caldwell AV Solutions. and used a folded catalogue to jam the door open behind me, just enough to slip out if I had to. I needed shelter, information, and most of all, time to think. I was still wearing my hoodie and cargo pants, phone in my pocket, but I had no service, no GPS, just a blank bar and searching in the top corner. The date still said May 4th, but the year wasn't showing. My watch, a Casio G-Shock, ticked away as usual, so at least I hadn't gone back in time. Probably. I rummaged through the store's back room, which hadn't been looted, odd in itself. I found a small portable wind-up radio and a sealed emergency kit tucked under the counter. The radio crackled to life after a few cranks, then settled into static. Then, a voice, faint, British, clipped. Repeating emergency notice. Zone 3 and beyond are considered unsalvageable. Remaining DEFRA units are advised to maintain quarantine. Medical units should not engage hostile infectees under any circumstances. The signal faded, then returned with the same message again. Zone 3, that's Clapham, Camden, Southwark. If those areas were unsalvageable, then whatever happened here wasn't recent. I needed out. I needed answers. I waited until dawn before moving again. The city was grey and misty, soft light refracting off wet brick and glass. I moved south, sticking to alleyways and side streets, using an old AZ guidebook from the store as my map. Every so often I passed scenes frozen in time. A double-decker bus crashed into a storefront, its windows cracked, its seats eerily empty. An overturned police van on Oxford Street, a child's bicycle still upright, abandoned beside a park bench. I found the first body near Holborn. He wasn't infected, at least not in the sense the movie depicted. He was starved, emaciated, wearing a paramedic's uniform with the badge G. Wheeler. His ID said he worked for London Ambulance Service. He had a journal in his chest pocket. The last entry was dated the 23rd of April. It read, "South corridor collapsed. We lost Randall trying to secure the gate. Supplies are low. No evac from Westminster. We hear them at night, screaming. We saw one jump from the 6th floor yesterday, still moving, still screaming. I can't." The ink trailed off. I had to face the truth. I wasn't in my world anymore. This was a parallel Earth where the rage virus was real, where the outbreak didn't end with a helicopter rescue on the coast or a cheerful sunrise montage. This version of Britain fell hard. At midday, I found another survivor, or rather, she found me. Her name was Sarah Delling, late 20s, former Territorial Army, now armed with a rusted fire axe and a battered field radio. She'd been watching me from a 4th floor flat in Holborn and came down after I passed her building twice without drawing attention from the infected. She didn't trust me at first, of course. Who would? But after I showed her I had no bite marks, no strange behaviour, and offered her a tin of peaches from the AV store's break room, she let me into her shelter. It wasn't much. A reinforced flat with blackout curtains, water collected from rooftop tarps, solar-powered chargers, and a small armoury of blunt objects. Her most dangerous weapon was a civilian-issue Sig Sauer P226 with 6 rounds left, salvaged from a dead Met officer months ago. She had one rule: don't make noise, not even crying. She kept a stash of cotton balls just to stuff in her mouth if she panicked. The infected, she told me, don't stop. Not like in movies. They don't need food or rest. They burn out after a few weeks, yeah. But new ones keep popping up, fresh, hungry. I asked about the government, the military, evacuation zones. She laughed, dry, bitter. If there's a government, they're not in London. Not anymore. Over the next 3 days, I stayed with her, helping reinforce barricades and scavenging nearby for supplies. We used rooftop crossings to avoid street-level movement. She taught me signals: 2 taps on a pipe for all clear, 3 for danger, and always, always be ready to run. On the 4th night, we saw them. A pack of 4 infected sprinting down Shaftesbury Avenue, arms flailing, mouths open in animalistic rage. One slammed into a parked car so hard it dented the hood. Another stopped and screamed, a blood-curdling, raw-throated howl that echoed across buildings. Then they were gone. Sarah didn't speak for hours after that. That night, I stared at the LFE's control panel, still strapped to my backpack. One charge left, one more activation, but no idea if it would take me home or deeper into this ruined world. The device hummed softly, the OLED screen pulsing with faint telemetry readouts. Frequency drift, energy reserve, field coherence. I'd built it to scan for micro variations in reality lattice signatures. Fringe stuff that should never have worked, yet somehow it had. But without a stable anchor point, jumping again would be like throwing a dart blindfolded across dimensions. I might land in a pocket of open space, or inside a wall, or just nowhere at all. Sarah was sleeping lightly in the corner, wrapped in a black wool blanket, her axe close to hand. The radio beside her crackled occasionally, still tuned to the emergency broadcast frequency. I'd grown used to the looped message by now. Zone 3 unsalvageable. DEFRA units maintain quarantine. But sometimes, just sometimes, it would shift. Not change exactly, but flicker in modulation like another signal was struggling to push through beneath it. Almost like someone was trying to talk underneath a jammed channel. The idea gnawed at me. If someone was broadcasting, they were either military or survivors with infrastructure. Either way, they'd know more than we did, and knowledge was the most valuable currency left. The next morning, I brought it up with Sarah over a breakfast of tinned beans and crushed crackers. We sat by the window, watching the grey sky hang low over London's shattered skyline. She was cautious as ever, eyes flicking toward the street every few seconds. But when I explained what I thought I was hearing, an alternate signal, embedded inside the emergency loop, her expression changed. A sliver of hope, buried under months of exhaustion and fear, surfaced in her gaze. There was a group, she said after a pause. Used to be near the Imperial War Museum, old TA bunker under the archives. Word was they had a repeater tower and some kind of clean zone. Might be what you're hearing. The Imperial War Museum, Lambeth Road, south of the river. That meant crossing one of the bridges, all of which had been destroyed, barricaded, or swarmed according to Sarah. She'd lost a friend on Vauxhall Bridge 2 months prior. They never even saw what got him. Just a scream, then silence, then a blood trail that disappeared into the river. But I had an idea. King's College London had an underground service tunnel network connecting various campuses. I'd read about it during a project back in my world involving network redundancy for university servers. Some of those tunnels led under the Thames, used back in the 1940s to ferry equipment between King's, Guy's Hospital, and the old South Bank medical annexes. It was a long shot, and Sarah was sceptical, but she agreed. We spent the day prepping, filling water bottles, rationing what little food we had, taping noise-dampening foam around the soles of our boots, and fashioning rudimentary masks from filter cloth and wire mesh. Not for disease, but for the smell. The closer you got to water in this version of London, the worse it got, like something rotten had soaked into the brick and never left. We moved at first light the next day, taking a circuitous route south through Covent Garden, cutting through side streets and service alleys, ducking through storefronts and lobbies like ghosts. I carried the LFE unit in a padded laptop bag strapped to my chest. Sarah led the way, her movements fluid and efficient, eyes constantly scanning. We found the tunnel entrance near the Aldwych campus. A collapsed maintenance stairwell opened into a yawning shaft of darkness, the steel railing twisted by time and neglect. Inside, the air was thick and metallic, the only light coming from our filtered torches. We moved slowly, careful not to let our boots echo, passing rusted signs that still bore the names of departments long since abandoned. Medical records, biophysics, archives. Twice, we had to stop and wait. Once for the sound of shuffling footsteps far above us, and once for what I can only describe as a guttural screech from deep in the walls, like something feral had learned to navigate the pipes. The tunnel under the river was partially collapsed, but just passable if we crawled. Water dripped steadily from overhead conduits, and the walls were covered in a slick black mould that pulsed faintly under our torchlight. Sarah didn't speak for the entire crawl. She just moved with grim determination, her jaw clenched tight. I followed, hands shaking, the LFE pressing against my chest like a lifeline. We emerged near the St. Thomas's Hospital ruins. The old south entrance was partially scorched, the ceiling blackened from fire, and several ambulances had been rammed into the doors to block them. We didn't linger. South Bank was quieter than the north side, but more dangerous in a different way. You couldn't rely on noise to warn you of movement. Here, the infected waited in buildings, in shadows, in silence. By midday, we reached the Imperial War Museum. The entire structure looked like it had been in a siege, chunks of the facade blasted out, scaffolding twisted like metal spiderwebs, and sandbags forming crumbling perimeters. The dome was still intact, rising over the wreckage like a weary sentinel. We made our way in through a side maintenance hatch, and that's when we heard it. Voices. Real, live human voices. Cautious, disciplined, and armed. They found us first. A fire team in mismatched fatigues, with suppressed SA-80 rifles and gear that looked pieced together from different regiments. Their leader, a woman in her 40s with short greying hair and a Scottish accent, identified herself as Sergeant Major Dana Kerr, Royal Engineers. She didn't lower her weapon until I showed her the LFE and mentioned the signal on the emergency broadcast loop. They took us below, down into what used to be the museum's climate-controlled archive vaults. Now it was a survivor stronghold. The lights ran off solar-charged batteries and a makeshift fuel cell array using reprocessed ethanol. There were 36 people, medics, technicians, even a few kids. Most were former military, NHS personnel, or civil defence volunteers. They called the place Echo Green. They'd survived by maintaining total radio silence and using short-range encrypted bursts for coordination. The signal I'd picked up wasn't meant to be heard. It was a carrier tone, embedded in the static to verify that the node was still alive. Dana was both amazed and concerned I'd found it. We spent 2 days with them, recovering, resupplying, and most importantly, learning. The virus hadn't started the way the movie claimed. There was no Peter raid on a Cambridge lab, no chimpanzees with implanted aggression circuits. Instead, it began as a military biocontrol project called Janus, originally meant to enhance reaction times and increase tactical aggression in frontline troops. It was field tested in a facility called Project Redwall, buried under the Brecon Beacons in Wales. But something went wrong. The viral vector mutated, got into the civilian population through contaminated water during a logistics exercise in Swindon. Within weeks, it had spread to London. Then, it all fell apart. Operation Infirmary, the codename for London's quarantine, had been a joint MOD and NHS command effort, but they'd failed to isolate the infected early, believing the aggression could be chemically suppressed. By the time they authorised force, entire boroughs had gone silent. The last real government orders came in October, 4 months after Patient Zero. After that, it was just automated broadcasts and scattered survivor pockets like Echo Green. Sarah listened quietly as Kerr explained this, her face unreadable. When Kerr mentioned Project Redwall still possibly being operational and potentially holding the original pathogen data, she finally spoke. "If we want to stop this from happening anywhere else," Sarah said, her voice cold and even, "we need that data." Kerr didn't argue, she just nodded. That night, I recalibrated the LFE using Echo Green's power station to boost its diagnostic range. I plotted a theoretical anchor signature that might bring me closer to my own Earth, based on environmental flux and background radiation, but my instincts screamed that I was still missing something critical. The raw data I was picking up from this world, the electromagnetic signature, the neutrino flux, even the cosmic microwave background, was slightly different than my Earth's baseline values. Not enough to be visible to the naked eye or noticeable to everyday instruments, but the discrepancy was consistent. This Earth wasn't just divergent in terms of history or events, it was fundamentally skewed at the quantum level, which meant navigating home wasn't just a matter of setting coordinates. It was like trying to jump across a river that was still flowing beneath your feet. I needed a stable anchor, a known, consistent frequency or mass that existed identically in both universes, a fixed point. And I had a growing suspicion that whatever had caused the breach in the first place, whatever had made the LFE's first activation tear through the veil instead of bouncing off it, was linked to Project Janus. If they'd somehow tapped into interdimensional frequencies during the early stages of their experimentation, intentionally or not, it could have distorted the fabric of this Earth just enough to let information, or matter, leak across. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My LFE wasn't the first to tap into this world, it was just the first to arrive with no idea what it was walking into. The next morning, Sarah and I sat with Sergeant Major Kerr in the command alcove of Echo Green's control center. The room had once housed the museum's temperature-controlled archival servers. Now it was converted into a rugged operations post, with salvage screens showing drone feeds, maps, and communications logs. On a large whiteboard, someone had sketched a crude but informative topographic layout of southern England, with known infected zones marked in red, dead zones in black, and sparse green circles indicating last known survivor holds. Kerr brought up a digital map on one of the salvaged MOD touchscreens and pointed towards central Wales. Brecon Beacons National Park, about 10 clicks southeast of Penwai Fan Summit, she said. Project Redwall was buried beneath an old Cold War radar station called Penrhos Watch Point. The locals always thought it was decommissioned back in the 80s, but we had field engineers in the TA who swore it was still pulling electricity as late as 22. Any chance there's still power down there? I asked, already knowing the answer. Doubtful, but if they had quantum containment, battery storage, or self-sustaining cells, maybe some subsystems survived. Kerr folded her arms. What you're talking about? Dimensional frequency drift, baseline distortion. It's above my pay grade. But if Redwall had anything to do with this mess crossing universes, it'll be in their black box servers. We knew what we had to do. A recon mission to the heart of where it all began. Not just to locate a path home for me, but to shut the door that should never have been opened in the first place. If Echo Green's guesses were right, the Redwall facility might still contain server banks with original Janus data. If I could extract even a few petabytes of it, I might be able to stabilize the LFE's field parameters for a return jump. Kerr gave us a team of 4. Corporal Ruben Asari, a former Royal Signals comms expert, Lance Corporal Katya Dobrev, who used to serve in the Royal Logistic Corps before the collapse, and 2 civilians with military backgrounds, James Lowry, an ex-British Army medic, and Devon Parks, a grizzled former electrical engineer who'd apparently helped wire half the MOD's hardened infrastructure in the early 2000s. They'd worked together before on supply runs and extraction ops, and knew how to move through hostile zones without drawing attention. We set out at dawn in a modified MAN HX 60 military truck powered by salvaged biodiesel and solar-augmented battery packs. The route would take us northwest out of London, skirting through Reading and Oxford, before dipping toward Hereford and finally into the Beacons. The entire journey, assuming clear roads, was about 200 miles. But in this world, clear roads was a fantasy. The motorways were choked with abandoned vehicles, overgrown vegetation, and in some cases, collapsed overpasses where the military had used explosives to cut off infected migration paths. By the time we passed through Slough, it was already clear this would be a slog. Entire stretches of the M4 had become overgrown forests of rust and tarmac. We moved slowly, stopping frequently to clear debris, backtrack, or scout ahead for ambushes. Though the infected didn't organize or lay traps, They were still dangerous in clusters, silent until provoked, then utterly unrelenting. Outside Reading, we encountered our first contact. A convoy of rusted Land Rovers blocked the road, and low makeshift tripwire traps had been laid across the verge. Someone was still protecting this area. We halted, engines off, and waited. Moments later, a series of hand signals from the tree line revealed a small group, well armed, clearly former reservists or volunteers. They didn't fire. Instead, a woman approached slowly with her hands raised. Her name was Harriet Cole, a former nurse turned field commander for a survivor enclave called Hollow Grove, based in the ruins of a private boarding school. They'd set up their own radio perimeter and had been monitoring movements along the road for weeks. We explained our destination and purpose without revealing the full truth. Even here, in a world where science had broken reality, you had to ration how much people could take in one sitting. Harriet warned us that the stretch past Swindon was particularly bad. Recent clusters had moved through, following noise from a derailed train weeks ago. She offered us a safer detour through rural backroads north of Oxford, though it would add another day to our journey. We accepted. That night we bivouacked on the edge of a dried-out reservoir near Highworth. Devon used the downtime to patch one of the truck's hydraulic systems with salvaged copper tubing and bits of a dismantled air conditioning unit. Sarah stood watch near a weathered wooden fence, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun dipped low, casting long, thin shadows across the empty countryside. It was almost peaceful, until you noticed how every bird had stopped singing after sundown. As I sat beside the vehicle, checking the LFE's internal charge level and logging new quantum flux readings into my tablet, Katya joined me, offering a small tin of boiled sweets she'd been hoarding. We didn't talk much, just shared the silence. But I saw the same thing in her eyes I saw in all of them. The slow, burning exhaustion of people who had survived too much, seen too many others die, and were now running on sheer willpower. We were less than 80 miles from Pen y Fan, but distance didn't matter out here. Danger was measured in decibels, in the strength of barricades, and in whether you had to travel during daylight or not. 2 days later, near the village of Abergavenny, everything changed. We hit what looked like a supply checkpoint. Canned food crates, old army tents, even a cracked communications dish. But it was a trap, not laid by the infected, but by others, humans, scavengers, desperate, organized, and armed. They called themselves the Glint Men, a mercenary-style gang formed out of remnants from failed military outposts and rogue defense contractors. Their gear was advanced: thermal imaging goggles, suppressed firearms, satellite phones jacked into surviving Starlink arrays. They had a base somewhere in the hills, but they moved in packs, hunting anything valuable: supplies, medicine, weapons, even people. They ambushed us as we investigated the tents. Reuben was hit first, shoulder wound clean through, but he managed to fall back into cover. Devon returned fire with a bolt-action rifle modified for long-range hits, taking down 2 of the attackers before the rest scattered. It was a sharp engagement, under 90 seconds, but the damage was done. We couldn't risk another fight, and our position was compromised. Sarah made the call. We'd push hard into the mountains, take lesser-known forestry trails, and abandon the main road entirely. Kerr's maps had marked an old MOD fuel depot along the ridgeline near Llanfrinach. If we could reach it, we could resupply and get a view of the valley leading to Pendrios Watchpoint. The terrain would be brutal: steep climbs, overgrown paths, potentially unstable rock. But it was either that or risk another run-in with the Glint Men. After what happened to Reuben, none of us were eager to cross paths with them again. He'd managed to patch himself up with Lowry's help and was moving, albeit slowly, with a sling rigged from gauze and an old rucksack strap. We cached the truck in a thicket of pine trees about 2 kilometers off the B4558, covered it with cut branches and a thermal blanket, and set out on foot with what we could carry. We followed the contour of the hill, moving single file through narrow switchbacks and gravel paths long since reclaimed by nature. Fallen logs, broken fences, and weather-worn signage marked the route. Ghosts of a world that had once been orderly and mapped. Now everything felt primal. The forest didn't feel welcoming. The air was dense with moisture, and birdsong had gone strangely silent as we gained elevation. It was as if even nature itself sensed what lay ahead. After nearly 4 hours of steady climbing, our boots slick with mud and our backs soaked with sweat, we reached the fuel depot. The place was little more than a reinforced concrete bunker nestled beneath a collapsed steel shed. Its thick blast door was buckled outward from the inside, rusted along the edges, but still sealed. Someone, or something, had tried to get out a long time ago. With some effort and a pair of hydraulic spreaders Katia had scavenged from a fire rescue truck, we managed to peel the door open wide enough to slip through one by one. Inside, the depot was dark and damp, but surprisingly intact. Rows of old steel drums sat stacked in neat grids beneath cracked halogen lights. The smell of diesel and mildew clung to everything. We checked for contamination. No infected, no recent tracks. Devon found an old breaker box and rerouted auxiliary power from a corroded wind turbine that had somehow survived the years. When the lights came on, it was a quiet victory. Not just illumination, but proof that some part of the old world still worked, however barely. We made camp there for the night, quietly eating reheated MREs around a flameless ration heater. No fires, no unnecessary noise. We knew better than to test our luck. That night, as the others tried to rest, I sat near the depot's observation platform overlooking the valley. The clouds had lifted slightly, revealing the outline of Pen Y Fan's summit under the starlight. My eyes tracked the faint glow in the valley below, irregular, pale blue light that pulsed in intervals. Redwall was still drawing power. That confirmed our suspicions. Whatever had started this mess, whether a virus, a weapon, or something more abstract, it was still running, or at least still alive. The LFE pulsed faintly in its sling on my chest, the small onboard sensors picking up residual electromagnetic emissions from the facility below. The closer we got, the more data it collected. Background fluctuations, ionization levels, gravitational anomalies so subtle that only quantum instruments could register them. This place wasn't just a lab, it was a wound in the fabric of reality. At first light, we broke camp and began the descent toward the valley. The trail was less forgiving than the climb. Sections of path had been washed out by landslides or overgrown with brambles as thick as a man's wrist. Twice we had to backtrack and cut new trails through dense underbrush, and once we were forced to crawl beneath a fallen bridge, the remnants of its stonework blackened by what looked like a controlled detonation. By midday, we reached the edge of what used to be a perimeter fence, 6 meters high, topped with collapsed razor wire and reinforced with anti-vehicle barriers. It had once encircled the Redwall site entirely, but much of it had caved inward or been torn down. Through a gap in the fence, we got our first clear look at the facility. Penrose Watchpoint had been a Cold War listening post originally, but Redwall had transformed it into something else entirely. The central structure was a squat, brutalist compound of poured concrete and armoured plating. Satellite dishes and antenna arrays jutted from the roof, long since tilted at unnatural angles. On the western side, a loading dock had collapsed into a sinkhole, revealing part of the underground structure below. Corrugated metal walls twisted by time in what looked like internal explosions. We moved in cautiously, scanning the area with thermal scopes and listening devices. No movement, no heat signatures except our own. Still, we advanced slowly. Sarah took point, her movements precise, always staying in cover. I followed close behind, with Devon and Reuben bringing up the rear. Lowry watched our flanks, and Katia monitored the radio bands for any irregular bursts of signal. The main entrance to Redwall was a massive vault-style door embedded in the side of a granite outcrop. Its control panel was dead, the keypad display cracked, but there was a manual override, an old mechanical access system tied into a buried crankshaft. Devon and Reuben worked it loose with effort, finally forcing the locking bolts to disengage with a deep, metallic groan. The door opened into a corridor lined with red LED strips, emergency power. The lights flickered as we passed, illuminating rooms filled with abandoned workstations, observation labs, and high-security storage vaults. We passed rooms labelled with alphanumeric codes Janus L1, Biosec 04, Crossfield isotopes. Every label sounded like it had been designed to obscure rather than explain. The air inside was dry, filtered, still pressurized. That meant the facility had sealed itself at some point after the initial incident, preserving its contents but also whatever damage had occurred within. We advanced slowly, checking each room for hostiles, but nothing moved. No infected, no bodies, just old machines humming softly in the background and red indicator lights blinking silently on servers whose protocols had long since gone obsolete. In one of the labs, I found what I'd come for. The primary Janus server core, built into a magnetic containment rack the size of a cargo van. The drives were still active, cooled by an internal nitrogen loop and shielded behind polycarbon panels. I interfaced with the terminal using a bridging adapter I'd built for the LFE, and to my relief, the encryption was based on protocols I recognized. Government secure, but not quantum locked. I began the data dump onto the LFE's internal storage, starting with experiment logs, then imaging records, then primary data sets. The transfer was slow. Terabytes of structured information scrolled past. Neural response mappings, synthetic aggression curves, cortical stimulation profiles. Then I found it. Janus Event Report Primary Breach. According to the logs, the breach hadn't been an accident. The researchers had been experimenting with cognitive waveform transference, attempting to map consciousness patterns into a virtual testbed using phase-locked neural oscillation matrices. It was supposed to simulate aggression without inducing it, but something had gone wrong. The waveform they'd copied had behaved erratically, then self-replicated. The software described it as an uncontained aggression loop, a kind of feedback that induced a real-world neural overload in test subjects exposed to it, even via indirect observation. The first test subject had been exposed via a VR interface. He'd gone into seizure within seconds. 10 minutes later, he attacked 2 technicians and died of cardiac arrest after biting through a power cable. Autopsy showed massive neural degradation, not unlike what was later observed in the infected. They digitized rage, and in doing so, they'd cracked open a dimensional fissure they didn't understand. The waveform, codenamed Janus 0, was never destroyed. It had been quarantined, isolated in a protected subsystem deep in Redwall's central data core. But the moment the facility lost primary containment during the collapse of the command structure, the failsafes failed. The waveform escaped its simulation matrix and broadcast itself. Not over radio, over reality, a quantum signal, a lattice resonance. The waveform had encoded itself into the base structure of this dimension, seeding itself not through infection in the viral sense, but through the very fabric of cognitive physics. The virus wasn't just biological, it was mimetic, systemic, dimensional. Sarah stood silently as I explained it, her face pale under the red lights. She didn't need a long speech, she understood. If Janus 0 had destabilized this world, and my LFE had locked onto it as a beacon, then the waveform was resonating across dimensions, waiting for a receiver. I was the receiver. The final act had to be precise. I reconfigured the LFE's output system, mapping the waveform's origin signature and preparing a controlled collapse. If I could anchor it with a reverse harmonic pulse, tied to the original lattice distortion coordinates, I could shut the signal down, at least here. I didn't know if it would fix the damage already done, but it would end the echo. And I could set the LFE to jump during the collapse phase, using the brief moment of coherence to guide me back to my own world. I gave Sarah my notes, the schematics, the logs, everything. We didn't say goodbye, just a quiet nod. I activated the device. The light turned cobalt again, and the world shattered. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.